Welcome everybody to tonight's social emotional learning webinar. This is our 5th session in the series, Social Awareness, Growing Empathy Across Differences. My name is Mackenzie Dyer. I am a program associate at the Professional Educator Standards Board, and I'm joined by my colleague Leonie Sherwin, as well as our presenter today, Dr. Bonnie McDaniel. So welcome everybody. So before we get started, just a couple reminders. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer those questions during the session today, but there will be a dedicated question and answer time about today's content with Bonnie at the end of the session. So if you have questions for her, please put those in the Q&A and we can answer those at the end of the session out loud. If you have other questions about clock hours and that kind of thing, we will also talk about those at the end of the session today. So like I just said, PESB will provide lots of clock hour information and answer questions about logistic type things at the very end of our session today. For attendance for clock hours, please do not put your name and email in the Q&A. It looks like there's about 200 people on our webinar today. So the Q&A can get really, really clogged up if everybody's putting their name and email addresses in there. Zoom records your name and email for us. And so at the end, will pull an attendance report in order to award your clock hours. So Zoom is automatically recording your name and email address. If there is a problem with that, you can, or if you think you need extra help with that, you can email me, and our email, Leonie and I's email addresses will be shared at the end of our presentation today. Just one more thing, this session is being recorded and the recording will be available in a couple of weeks after it's processed. So just so you know, you can go back and review it if you'd like to later. Just a little bit about PESB before we get started. PESB is the Professional Educator Standards Board, and we are one agency, and we have two boards. So one board is the Professional Educator Standards Board, and we also cover the Para-Educator Board. And our mission is to really ensure that Washington's workforce is composed of equity-minded professional educators who meet the diverse needs of students, schools, and communities. So on this slide are our mission, vision, and values, and you can find more information about us on our website as well. And I will pass it to Matt for the next slide.
Thank you. Before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that no matter where each of us are physically, we're on the traditional lands of Native Americans whose ancestors were this place we call home's original inhabitants. As we proceed with our work, let's make sure that our deliberations and recommendations benefit all their descendants equitably. We're also going to take a moment of silence here before we begin tonight, and we'd like to acknowledge the history of this nation. That's one that's fraught with many contradictions. For too long, this country has elevated a story of democracy and freedom while minimizing the impact of violence and oppression on marginalized communities whose backs this nation was built. Today, members of the Black and Asian communities and other communities of color continue to experience racism through police brutality, mass incarceration, inequitable education and health services, deportation, and other forms of subjugation. We aim to disrupt this legacy of systemic racism by centering racial equity and justice in the work that we do. This is how we stand with our communities of color. So before we begin tonight, we just want to offer a moment of silence to consider these words and how you might join us in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Today's facilitator, I'd like to introduce her to you. We are very thankful to have Dr. Bonnie McDaniel joining us today to lead us in this webinar about social awareness, growing empathy across differences, and practicing empathy in community with others. I have been blessed to be able to have been working with Bonnie for the last 2 or 3 years through the OSPI's Social Emotional Learning Advisory Committee. Dr. Bonnie McDaniel is the founder and executive director of Emotion Wise Counseling, LLC. She is a current member of OSPI's SEL Advisory Committee, Social Emotional Learning, representing the Washington PTA. Bonnie was instrumental in developing Washington's SEL implementation briefs for teacher and principal preparations, and she also participated in the work group that developed Washington State SEL standards, benchmarks, and indicators, and Washington State SEL implementation guide for educators. Bonnie has previously taught social and cultural foundations classes in educator preparation, and she now facilitates parenting for emotional well-being courses through the Lake Washington Schools Foundation. So Bonnie, we're so happy you are here with us today, and I would like to go ahead and just turn it over to you.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Leonie. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here with you this afternoon. As we arrive in this space together, please feel free to say hello to everybody here. Maybe drop hello into the chat. Let us know where you're from. Maybe share something that you like about spring. It was kind of warm out there a little bit this afternoon, so I've got my mind thinking about spring. So feel free to go ahead and say hello. Before we dive into our topic today on growing empathy, I want to spend a little time as we settle into this space together to kind of remind us of where we've been on this journey so far. So the last session where I was with you, we focused on emotional regulation. And I asked you to imagine what it would look like and what it would feel like if we were able to create environments at school that supported emotional well-being. And I want to share with you just a few examples of what you wrote. So I asked you what you would see happening, and this is just a small sample of some of the answers that you wrote. You said that students would be willing to speak without fear. There'd be calmness and more eagerness to share knowledge and creativity. There'd be more collaboration and a sense of belonging. And I asked you how it would feel, and you said safe, calm, joyous and exciting, peaceful, powerfully productive, awesome, like I want to be there, less stressful. And next, I'm going to move the slide. I asked, what's one small step that you could take that would take us in that direction toward ecologies of emotional well-being at school? And some of the things that you said was develop my own emotional well-being so that I can help students co-regulate with my calm. That's somebody who kind of knows what's going on. Model compassion, smile, greet people, a reflective journal for students, and connect before I correct, which I love. All of those are wonderful responses. And what I observed as I read through them is what a powerful vision this is. And it's one that many of you share. I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to come together in a space like this and realize that, you are not alone in dreaming about this. And I want to say, this is my dream too. It's why I do this work. I believe that it is possible to create these spaces where we can dream together, and then we can create spaces where we can get down to it and join together to make this happen. So I want to take a few deep breaths together and give ourselves a moment to take this in, to absorb this vision and to make it our own. And I want to remind you that this is these exercises that we do, they're experiential learning. So we learn self-awareness and emotional regulation by practicing them. So your experience, what you notice and learn about yourself in these moments is really more important than any of the words that I say. So I invite you to settle in comfortably in your chair. Give this a try. Close your eyes if you'd like to, and imagine yourself setting down the worries that you came here with. Know that they'll be there for you when we're finished today. And give yourself a few moments to be here in this present moment and just breathe. Notice where you feel the sensations of breathing in your body. Can you feel the sensation of your chest rising and falling as the air flows in and out? And now on an in-breath, I invite you to bring to mind one of the words from our list, and then a second word on the out-breath. So maybe it's calm on the in-breath, and maybe safe on the out-breath. And maybe you want to bring a gentle smile and think of the word joy on an in-breath, and peace on the out-breath. There might be another word that comes to you, which is great. See what resonates. The invitation is to bring a feeling associated with that word into your awareness, in rhythm with your breathing. As you relax into this space of feeling open and present to this moment that we're together, I invite you to take just a few more nice deep breaths in. And with the sound of a bell, we'll bring this practice to a close. All right, I invite you to open your eyes and rejoin us. And as you do, I invite you to savor the feelings that you brought to mind and let it settle into your bones. And like a kind friend or a curious scientist, just notice any changes in how you're feeling right now, how it might be just a little bit different from when we got started here today. If you want to go ahead and add that, oh, look at all the hellos from all over in the chat. Hello, loving the sunshine. All right. So we've just had an opportunity to practice compassionate self-awareness, to notice our feelings and sensations, and maybe make a shift from being, in more of that red zone where we feel a little bit of sense of threat. It's making us want to react in some way, to being a little bit more in that green zone, which we described as a state of calm, of ease, a state where we can recharge and restore, a state that's also filled with creative energy and a sense of hope and possibility. Did anybody notice even a small shift? We can start to see how these aspects of social and emotional learning work together. So how cultivating a capacity for self-awareness through these mindfulness practices can help you start to recognize the sensations and the signals that can tell you when you're shifting from the red zone, into the red zone, and maybe in time to hit the pause and try out some strategy, maybe before you lose your cool, or in time to reset and set an intention when it's really important to you to show up for somebody from your most regulated place. And then when it comes to empathy, which we'll be talking about today, can you start to imagine how it can be helpful to recognize when you're feeling safe and when you're feeling threatened before you interact with someone who is in some form of distress, and how a capacity to show acceptance toward your own emotions can help you to be more accepting and open to other people's emotions. And how it can be helpful to have spent some time reflecting on maybe your own patterns of emotional response, developing your own self-awareness about your own history, and thinking a little bit about how you want to show up for people before you jump into some conversation with someone, especially maybe someone who pushes your buttons. And then how gaining some skills with when you're in that red zone, how you can shift yourself out of that, maybe take a few deep breaths, maybe just take a little bit of a break, maybe just set an intention, call a mantra to your mind about how you want to show up. Those things can help get you into that place where you're ready to show up with empathy for somebody else. And all of these things build on one another, which is why I have that image of a spiral there. As we develop compassionate self-awareness, we can then develop emotional regulation skills that helps us show up with more empathy, that then helps us build relationships that contributes to our sense of well-being. And so you can see how it goes. All right, so let's jump into a little bit more of a discussion about what empathy is, what it's all about. And I want to start off with a few quotes that get at different aspects of empathy. So the first is from Brené Brown. You may be familiar with Brené Brown. And she starts off with this idea that empathy is feeling with people. So to feel and imagine over here what it's like to be you over there. This is empathy at its most basic level, the level of feeling, and it's pretty automatic. A kid stubs their toe and you wince. Our brains are wired to do this. You may have heard about the mirror neurons, these networks that produce a simulation in our brains of what we perceive others to be feeling. That gives us a clue about how to act. And you can imagine how the system helped us survive in the past. Like if a member of our tribe has a look of fear on their face, and we're going to have that simulated feeling of fear, and that's going to help us react in an appropriate way in that situation. So that's the first aspect of empathy, that resonating feeling. But there's more to it. And so let's take a look at the second quote. And that is, empathy takes courage. The courage to cast loose from the familiar moorings of yourself and your known positions, and to enter the deep waters of the other person, to be truly moved inside, truly affected in your own core. And that's from Rick Hansen. And so there, I think you're starting to get a sense for how much more there can be to empathy. This idea of casting loose from the familiar moorings of yourself. Like, what is that about? Like, that sounds hard. I'm pretty comfortable with my own moorings. And you can see how, or start to imagine how that self-awareness and self-regulation can help us move, from one position to the other. It can be kind of difficult to do. And so that's the imagination part. We can start to see empathy, as this capacity that we build, a social and emotional skill that develops as we develop that capacity for self-awareness and emotional regulation. So that's the feeling aspect and the cognitive or imagination aspect. And there's one more piece, and that's captured, I think, in this third quote, which is, empathy is the art of stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person, understanding their feelings and perspectives, and then using that understanding to guide our actions. And that's from Roman Krznaric. who wrote a book about empathy. And so that last quote speaks to this third aspect. Once we are emotionally resonating with another person and we've kind of quieted the chatter in our own minds enough to really start to imagine the other person's perspective, really engaging our minds to think about this other person's experience and how they make sense of their situation, then we put those pieces together and respond in an appropriate way based on what we know about that other person and what would be uniquely helpful for them. So those are the three aspects that I want to introduce, and that is so an affective or feeling component, a cognitive or imagination component, and then a motivation to act. So you can see there's some complexity to it. I think empathy can be something that we start off thinking, oh, I know what that is, and I'm great at that. I consider myself to be guilty of that. I certainly thought that was something I was particularly good at. And then I started reading about it and thought, actually, there's a whole lot more to it. And it's harder than I thought. So, but I want to talk. So now I want to talk a little bit about why empathy matters. Because I think it's something that can be taken for granted, like some of the other social emotional skills, but it's important. And I think if we stop and think about it a little bit, that can become really clear. Empathy can calm and comfort a young person in distress. And so, as some of you mentioned, you can co-regulate with each other if you can show up in this calm, accepting presence and really be open to someone else's experience. They'll sense that calm. And it can strengthen your relationships, help you build trust, and reduce power struggles. So again, if that student experiences you as this calm, non-anxious presence and sees that you're genuinely curious about understanding his or her or their point of view, that's going to allow them to really feel seen. And then you can build on that sense of connection to build your relationships. Also, when you respond with empathy, it can help you build your students' own capacity for insight and self-regulation. So when you show up and you're looking to understand a young person's mind, their mind beneath their behavior, you're signaling that matters. It matters to you, and they get the sense that their inner state is a valuable thing, and that can help them value those parts of themselves too. So what you're able to do is allow them to kind of put their own feelings and their experience into words. And so as they do that, they're learning about themselves at the same time. And so finally, leading with empathy, I think, can make it easier to problem solve. So feeling calm by your kindness and your acceptance, then it makes it easier for kids or anyone to engage. We talked about the upstairs brain, the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that's responsible for all those high-level executive functions that we want our kids to be able to use well, like decision-making and moral reasoning, and of course, empathy itself. So those are some ideas about why empathy matters. And I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think? In what ways is responding with empathy? How does that show up as being important for you? You can feel free to add that in the chat. And as you think about that, we'll go ahead and talk about how to think about the empathetic response steps. So the next slide. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about this. And here, this is just one way of thinking about different stages or steps in responding empathetically to someone else. And I think the reason I think it can be helpful to think of this in a sequence is because often, and I would say I have been guilty of this, we rush in to provide that support immediately, and it's harder to see. And many of us aren't really experienced with those early steps that can really make a difference in the way that we show up and how helpful we can be for someone else. So the first one I just say is tune in. And that's tuning in both to yourself, do, just a really quick check-in. Where am I? If it's helpful for you to think about colors, am I in the red zone? Is it more orange? Where am I? How am I showing up? How am I feeling? And then set an intention. Okay, my intention here is to be present and curious and open to what's happening here. You know, so, and this is where sometimes a mantra can be helpful if you've thought about that in advance, like what's a quick thing that you can say to yourself about how you want to show up? You know, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be present. I'm going to listen. And then so the second step, oh, I guess is something else to talk about in terms of tuning in, is that there is that nonverbal aspect of tuning in. So think about ways that you can send a message to that other person that says, I'm here with you. You know, you're not alone with this. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about nonverbal communication in just a minute. And so the second step is to take that imaginative leap, and you can just sort of visualize the leap there in that picture, you know, over to their side of the court. You know, think about how the situation looks and feels to the person that you're talking to, given their unique qualities. You can ask questions that help you really explore and understand their landscape. And in this process as well, naming and validating emotions can be really important, and a step that can be easy to overlook, but you know, can provide a lot of support to the person that you're talking to. Reflecting back, oftentimes, especially when there are intense emotions involved, hearing something like, I hear you saying this, and is this right? Am I getting you correctly? Can really provide more of those signals that, you know, I'm here with you, I'm getting you, what you're saying is important. And then finally, the last step with that is to respond with wisdom, show support, meet emotional needs that may exist, you know, if they need reassurance, they need comfort, and then, you know, ask and see if there's if there's problem solving that's necessary to do. How can I support you? How can I help you? And that will be the place where the problem solving comes in. But that would be toward the end of the process. And so next, I want to talk about those nonverbal skills and things to notice with empathy. And here, this is rooted in the work of Helen Rice, who is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And she developed an empathy training program for doctors, teaching them how to look beyond the words that their patients were saying and how to notice nonverbal cues to try to interpret their meaning better and respond appropriately, and found that the patient's health improved significantly after doctors had this training. So as I read through these, I want you to think about how much do you notice? You know, is this information that you routinely take in and interpret and are responding to in communication with someone else? And they are so they spell out the word empathy, which is clever. And E is for eye contact. You know, research shows that how we interact with eye gaze is important in making an emotional connection. M is for muscles of facial expression. So our brains are wired to mimic the facial expressions of others. And, you know, are you noticing facial expression? Are you aware of how your facial expression might be, influencing others? P is for posture, which can reveal quite a bit about emotional states. A is for affect. Those are the emotions that you can notice and name. That's often at the core of some of our most difficult or challenging conversations. T is for tone of voice, which conveys quite a bit of the nonverbal emotional contact when you're communicating with someone. And then H and Y. H is for hearing the whole person, listening for, you know, the whole person behind the behavior that you're observing, noticing, you know, the sort of inner world, you know, their inner thoughts and feelings and beliefs. And finally, your response. So how do you feel when you're in the presence of that other person? Pay attention to, you know, your own feelings and how you're resonating in that moment. So does that all make sense there? What do you guys think about those aspects of communication? Are those things that you guys pick up on? I want to give you just a short example of how this can matter. And I think maybe this I've heard similar types of stories of how this can matter. And this incident is from my own experience with my own teenagers. And we were having a challenge around a dating situation. And, so I go in with this, I want to have a talk about this. And what I notice immediately in a communication is that I'm asking questions and she's not responding. And back then, I'm very aware of words and not so aware of nonverbal communication. And so in that moment, all I notice is that I'm not being responded to. Whereas now I think about this and I think about all of the ways that my daughter was communicating with me nonverbally, posture, low eye contact, different types of tension. And if I had been in tune with that, I might have noticed and responded in a different way instead of noticing, oh, I'm just not being responded to. So I want to, share that experience. And I think maybe you've had a similar sort of experience maybe with other people where, noticing all the different types and forms of communication that are coming at you can really help make a difference in responding appropriately to another person. So now I want to share with you a few very common empathy misfires. And this is just a short list of some of the things that we can all fall into that keep us from showing up as empathetic as we might like to be. And the first one, this is no surprise to anyone. You can see by the picture, and this is the world we live in, right? Distracted. We're just there, but not there. And this is a challenge for our society, for our civilization in schools. And it's worth pointing out that one of the many things that is doing is it's interrupting our capacity to relate empathetically to one another. The second is upstaged. So this is a person who takes over the conversation with their own experience, and with the best of intentions, thinking that their experience is totally relevant, and but it can block empathy. A fixer, and I hinted about this already, this is someone who moves immediately to try to solve the problem, again, with the best of intentions, trying to be helpful. Defensive, someone who takes everything personally, even if it's not about them. And the minimizer is someone who tries to make you feel better by telling you there's not that bad, or you'll get over it, it could be worse. So do any of those sound familiar to you? Are those things that you maybe recognize in, partners, friends? Does anybody recognize any of those in themselves? Among that list, is there something there where you're going, oh yeah, you know what? That could be me. That might be me. I see myself there. You might take a note of that and think about one of those. That might be something to think about or to work on. All right. So in addition to those very common empathy misfires, there are some specific challenges with empathy when we're in the red zone, which is that threat system that is designed to help us detect and respond to threat quickly. And so that system, which was designed to help us move, and act, and gives us this burst of emotion so that we can take action and avoid, the predator on the savannah. Does that sound like a place where we're likely to be very good at empathy for other people? We're mainly focused on our own survival in that place. And so what action do I need to take to deal with this problem? And so we all respond in unique ways that have to do with how our own personal past experience shapes our interpretation of the moment, what's happening in the moment. But there are some common patterns to look out for. And I based some of this work on the work of Marshall Rosenberg, who has written about nonviolent communication. Some of you may be familiar with that. So first is black and white thinking. So we tend to assume that we are right and the other person is wrong. that the problem is that other person and that we are innocent and blameless. So very sort of dyadic, black and white types of perceiving. Also that we tend to think that we already know what we need to know about the other person's behavior and intentions, and that our story is the real one, the one that really matters. And so in calmer moments, like perhaps this one, we can start to imagine that, if I think that, probably other people do too. And so maybe we'll need to work on communication a little bit to put together a more complete picture of what's going on. So the second thing is autopilot. So when we're in the red zone, we're more likely to trigger old movies from our past that are based on how we responded to situations, maybe from our own childhood, like what's a go-to. We develop these patterns of, do I freeze up? Do I shut down? Do I slip into maybe people-pleasing mode? Those are when we're responding in a way that doesn't seem to fit situation at hand very well, that can be a clue that maybe some of these old scripts, these old movies are playing. And those can keep you from being in the present moment and really showing up for someone and imagining things from their point of view. And then finally, ignoring emotions in the red zone. So it's a place typically of high emotion, and those emotions are designed to help us take action, but it can be very difficult in the red zone to notice and detect those emotions, to be mindful of our own emotional expression and how that might be influencing the flow of communication. And that can be a problem because often in those instances, it's the feelings and the emotions that really matter. So, but in the red zone, things are happening so fast and you're thinking in black and white, and you've got, sometimes you're just going on autopilot and looking for the problem out there in the world, and we can miss the feelings that are actually really driving the behavior and motivating the behavior of the person that we're communicating with. So I invite you to think about a time when you were in the red zone or communicating with somebody who is in the red zone, and see if you can see evidence of any of these things in that interaction. Simplistic thinking, acting on autopilot, or ignoring emotions. And then if you take a compassionate look inward, maybe you can detect some evidence of how your own ability to be empathetic could be hindered by any of these factors when you're in the red zone. And this is where the self-awareness, especially compassionate self-awareness, because if this looks familiar to any of you, you're human. Welcome to being human. That's certainly I recognize these things in myself. But with these practices of self-awareness and emotional regulation, we can make some progress in this. We can start to recognize, hey, I'm moving into this space, and I know from reflection that I'm not at my best in terms of responding the way that I would want to when I'm in that space. And so, I'm going to take some kind of action that works for me to move into a better place where I can show up, where I'm more likely to show up the way I want to. All right, so this is a lot of information, and I want to give you all a little bit of time to sort some of this out for yourself. Figure out, what's landing for you, how you want to process some of this for yourself. So I want to invite you to turn that compassionate and curious lens inward and bring to mind a situation where empathy comes relatively easily. So imagine maybe a particular person or a particular situation, and think about what you notice, about what it feels like. What are the nonverbal cues that maybe you're sending or that you're picking up that helps to make that empathetic connection come more naturally to you? So we'll take a few minutes to think about that. And then after you've thought about that, think about a situation in which empathy is more difficult. And See if you can bring that curious scientific attitude to sort of notice what's going on in those situations. What does it feel like? What do you notice in your body in terms of tension or stress? Are there nonverbal signals that you're getting or that you're receiving? And what are the aspects of that situation or the relationship that might be making it more difficult? And then finally, what's an empathy skill that you'd like to develop? Maybe something has landed so far that you're thinking, that could be an area for me to work on. So we're going to open up a Padlet, and someone's going to put that link in the chat. And we're going to take about 5 minutes for this reflection. We'll have a little bit of music for you, hopefully, while you write. And I just want you to just take a second and do some of this work and think about these questions. And then if you are willing, please do share your reflections in the Padlet so that we can all learn from each other. So we'll take about 5 minutes for this exercise. While you're right, I just want to add that there's another question there about what's in your backpack. And that's going to be a question that you're welcome to respond to it now. The idea is, what is it that you want to take with you? What do you want to remember? And you can start working on it now, and then we'll revisit it at the end of our session as well. All right, it's 4:55. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that little break and had a chance to fill out the Padlet and enjoy and appreciate the wonderful responses. What I'm loving about this Padlet is that folks are responding to each other and chiming in, and so much affirmation and communication going on amongst yourselves. That's one of the hardest things about webinars like this, is that it's so difficult to facilitate real human communication, which is kind of ironic when you're talking about real human communication. But it's good that we can at least provide some of these tools for you guys to interact with each other a little bit. All right, so now please continue to fill that out, take some time and really, I would, if you can, spend some time with that and read through. There's just so much wisdom. I'm seeing a lot of similar kinds of ideas. The challenges are interesting. I'm in a hurry. Yeah, so often, and we'll hear about this a little bit later, that, can we please just slow down a little bit? Can we slow down and breathe? That can make a huge difference. All right, so what I want to talk about now is a little bit about empathy and chronic stress. And maybe take a few deep breaths, settle back in, and think about this. This is kind of, it's the water we're swimming in right now, right? The fact that we are in the middle of a youth mental health crisis isn't news to you. This is something that I'm sure you're seeing in your classrooms. To give just a sense of, just one number, that the Casey Foundation has reported a 34% increase in the number of kids diagnosed with anxiety or depression by a doctor between 2016 and 2020, which is up to 15% of all kids. So a lot of these anxiety and depression had been on an uptick steadily before the pandemic, and the pandemic came and, it made situations even more challenging for a lot of students. So because that's kind of the water that we're swimming in right now, just a couple things that I want to mention about that. And that is, when we are experiencing a threat, as many of you know, the stress hormone cortisol moves into the brain and gives us that burst of energy to respond to the threat. But when we're living in an environment, when we're experiencing chronic stress, that steady release of cortisol over time can have some pretty major consequences. And one of the things that it does is that it oversensitizes the amygdala, which is like the alarm center of the brain. And so that alarm rings more easily and more loudly over time. So if you think about it, if you know somebody, maybe you yourself, who seem to experience a little more threat in a situation than would make sense to you or to somebody else, this is an effect, potentially an effect of chronic stress. And second, that chronic release of cortisol can actually do some damage to neurons in the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that allows us to kind of put things into appropriate context to determine, that was then and this is now, or, this is something that happened to me in my childhood, but this situation is very different. And so again, if you think about that person you may know who is having a challenge responding, appropriately within a particular context and picking up clues about that, that could be an effect of something that has shifted or changed as a result of chronic stress or trauma in their lives. And so Dr. Bruce Perry is a clinician and a researcher at Northwestern University, and he works with kids who've experienced trauma, and he wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey that I think hit the bestseller list. It's called What Happened to You. It's a lovely book and one I recommend. And what I'm learning from them is that when we start to understand some of the effects of chronic stress and trauma on the brain, and especially young people, we start moving away from reacting, with frustration or exasperation when kids are behaving in a way that we don't expect, and that doesn't really fit into the context. And instead of wondering, having that thought come to our minds of what's wrong with you, right? We move toward a more compassionate and curious question, which is the one that they advocate for, which is, what happened to you? There's a story behind it, and we don't know. Oftentimes we don't know what that story is. And that question can open the door to empathy with someone who might be behaving in a way that we initially experience as frustration, or that just doesn't make sense to us. So it can be difficult, to even overwhelming, to be really open to all the stress and the strain that's out there among our students and our colleagues and our families. And although we would like to, we can't solve all of the problems out there by ourselves. So one of the trainings that I've taken, and maybe some of you have as well, has been in mental health first aid. And I like the first aid approach as a model of thinking about how we can respond in helpful ways to one another, even though we're not mental health professionals. There's still things that we can do to be in that situation, to make those connections and to respond to kids. And then sometimes also to put them in touch with other folks who can help them out, either a school counselor or other community resources and that sort of thing. So some of the things that Dr. Perry and others have pointed out to in terms of help first aid. The first is just connection. You've heard it, you believe it, probably, if you're interested in social emotional learning, that we are wired to connect with one another, and that belonging isn't some nice extra that maybe we can get to. It's actually a biological need, and social isolation can have a negative effect on us, both physically and on our mental health. And so Dr. Perry recommends we think of 3 R's in terms of regulate, relate, and then reason. And what he's suggesting is that we create these environments that feel safe, where kids can feel regulated. And then we prioritize our relationships and relate to them so they feel connected and they feel like they belong. And then we've created conditions where kids can learn well. Not only does it feel good, but these are also the cases, as many of you know, where kids learn the best, where we can access, get information all the way up to the prefrontal cortex and do some of that more difficult work. And the final idea, which I think is compelling and interesting, that he talks about, is how rhythm can have a restorative effect. And many of you know this as well, that having predictable patterns, that can be really comforting to know what's coming next. And he points out there are, traditional sources of healing that involve dance or drumming or song that can be very regulating for all of us. And so the question that I have for you is, like, what are some of the ways that you're already bringing some of these elements into your classroom? Any of you actively thinking about ways to bring, a sense of rhythm or predictability into your classes? If you've thought of that, I'd love to see that in the chat. And additionally, what are some of the ways that you create an environment that feels safe, that feels like is a place where kids feel like they belong? All right. As you think about that, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So already I feel like we've talked about some of the challenges with empathy, and probably maybe you never thought of it as something that was particularly easy, but the more I learn that I need to learn about empathy and what it how to do it well. And so I now view it as kind of a lifelong process, one that I'll never complete, in order to build my capacity for this, and particularly when it comes to being empathetic across some of these differences. And I want to just talk about a couple. And again, pretty briefly, all of these, we could do an entire lecture on any of them. But I just want to raise some awareness as you think about this topic, and hope maybe that will prompt you to do some thinking about for yourself, what are some of these other areas where you could do some reflection, or maybe something will come to mind that will support you to be empathetic across some of these differences. So the first one is power. Power and hierarchies are not helpful for relating empathetically to one another. And a couple of things that have been observed, and again, this is some of it's from Marshall, the nonviolent communication. And so those at the top of a powerarchy often, and he states this is just common, often don't realize the impact that their presence has on other people, right? So maybe you've observed that in someone who you consider to be a superior in some kind of hierarchy, and so then it's hard, right? And it's hard for me to think about, okay, I wonder if maybe I'm not thinking as much as I could when I'm the one in a position of power about my presence and how that impacts other people. So those can be some good questions to think about. Where am I located in this hierarchy, if there is a hierarchy, and how might that be affecting how other people experience me, right? In interpreting my signals. And another aspect of that is that people who feel themselves to be located in a more subordinate position in some kind of hierarchy tend to be more sensitive to hearing commands or judgments from those in higher in the hierarchy. And we can, imagine how that might show up, in our classroom, or even, in our families, if that's true. If it is, then it's common. That's a common experience. It's not a unique experience. So you might take just a second to reflect on, have you seen signs? Have you ever noticed someone who seems to be reacting to you when you're in a position of authority, like they're getting more criticism from you than you intended, right? That has certainly happened to me on more than one occasion. And so then we have an opportunity, if that's true, to think about, well, how can I work with that, right? Like, what can I do to send signals that will be more assuring? Maybe lean a little bit more in the direction of like, what sort of tone of voice or what kind of posture, or, something that how can I signal this even a little bit more than I think I need to, just to recognize that can be something that happens within power relations. The second one I want to talk about, again, just briefly, is age, right? And this one seems obvious, that, children do not experience the world the same way that adults do, that their brains are developing, and that the prefrontal cortex, the part that allows us to do all of those great executive functions like, planning and decision making and thinking empathetically about other people, those are still being developed, and all the way through childhood and adolescence and even into young adulthood. So there's sometimes a pretty big distance to travel, right? And a pretty big distance from where we are and how we see the world to really imagine what the world might be like for that younger person, at their particular age and stage of development. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that makes that leap over into someone else's world, particularly difficult. Sometimes I think adults can be inclined to generalize from their own experience, and assume that, because I've been a student or I've been a child, and, when I was your age, this happened to me, which can be super helpful. There's definitely a place for that, but it can also interrupt, or it causes to not really see what's unique and different about, this child and their experience and their world. The world they're growing up in is so different certainly from the one that I grew up in. And finally, the last one that I want to talk about is culture. And so this is an unfortunate but consistently shown by research thing that is true about empathy, is that we tend to feel more empathy toward people that we consider to be in our in groups, and less empathy toward people who we consider to be in our out groups. An example of this is when people were asked, and this is from Helen Rice's research in her book on empathy, people were asked to rate what was going on in the mind of someone when they were talking about a dating experience. And what they found was people tended to have greater accuracy when they were thinking about someone who shared ethnicity with them. So some of this makes sense, and some of it you can imagine was rooted to our history, as human beings, where we lived in tribes, and it was more likely that the stranger was going to be a source of danger, and so it was safer for people. Maybe they did better when they made those assumptions that a stranger represented a potential threat. So this is something I think that's important to be aware of with empathy, and to cultivate some self-awareness of. And some people have actually said, well, empathy is problematic because of this. And I think, where I tend to go with this is that empathy is part of a set of skills. It's not the only thing that matters. And if you take time to, sort of reflect on that for yourself, and with compassion, right? Like, notice, okay, so I do notice a little bit of this. And if I do, again, welcome to the human family, because it's common. There's a history to that. There's reasons for that. And it's possible for us to make choices to say, and that's not how I want to show up in the world. And I want to do some things. I want to, use some of these tools that I'm developing with emotional regulation to make a different choice. If I notice, for example, that when I'm in a situation with people who are different from me, that I tend to feel a little bit of tension. There's just some tension there. You can become aware of that, and maybe sort of lean in the opposite direction a little bit, like intentionally, take some breaths and release some of that tension, calm. So those are just some ideas about the ways that we can notice when this is true, if this is true, when we're in situations with people who are different from us, and can take action, to show up in ways that are consistent with how we want to show up in the world with other people. All right. So the last thing that I want to talk with you about is we've talked a lot about things that individuals can do. How can you, what can you do? What can, as an individual, to cultivate self-awareness, to, build these regulation tools and to show empathy toward other people. But to address some of the really deep and systemic challenges that we're facing, structural oppression, racism, sexism, classism, we need more than just an individual approach. And so what I want to say about this is that I'm still personally doing my work, and I'm kind of at the beginning of my journey to really understand how, what my position is in these systems of injustice and how that impacts the way that I relate to people. And doing more listening right now on this topic than speaking, because that's where I'm at. And one of the voices that I'm listening to is someone by the name of Dr. Sean Ginwright. He's a scholar and a activist, and his research examines the ways that youth in urban communities navigate poverty and can work to create justice in their schools. And so he wrote a book called The Four Pivots: Reimagining Justice and Reimagining Ourselves. And in that, Dr. Ginwright encourages us to move beyond a model of trauma-informed care towards something that he calls healing-centered engagement, and that this is the core of sustainable change. He says is healing, and that requires of us 4 pivots. And some of these sound familiar. I think it's resonant with the work that we've been doing and the things that we've been thinking about so far. Because the first pivot is in awareness. And he talks about that as from a lens to a mirror, to just looking outward, to take that moment for self-reflection and do some exploration of who we are as individuals and how we contribute to the world that we want to create. And the second pivot that he talks about is from transactional relationships to transformational ones, and to cultivate those deeper human connections through vulnerability and through really listening to one another with empathy. And the third pivot is from problem fixing, because many of us identify as problem fixers, to possibility creators, to spend some time not just thinking about what's wrong, but what's right, what are our strengths, and what's the possibilities that we can create, what's the world we want to live in. And I'm seeing a lot of evidence in some hearts and with that idea. And then finally, the fourth pivot is a pivot in presence. And he calls this from hustle to flow. And this is, I'm looking at the very first the challenge to what blocks our ability to be empathetic. And it's, I'm in a hurry, and he talks about that as an addiction to frenzy. How can we move to an existence of a little bit more calm, a little bit more well-being, maybe just a little bit slower. And so I'd like for you all to listen for a couple minutes. I have a little video that I'd like to show of Dr. Ginwright talking about his model of healing-centered engagement and what that's about.
Trauma. So what is healing-centered engagement? Really, what is it, right? So I know a lot of people have talked about healing-centered engagement, and people are practicing these healing-centered strategies. I want to say that healing-centered engagement is 3 things. It's a perspective, which is how we see young people and the causes of harm. It's also an approach, which is how we actually support them, but it's also a strategy that we use in our organizations. It is not only a therapeutic response, because we're not using only a medical model to respond and understand trauma. The medical model, again, says that this young person had trauma, let me treat this person. Trauma-informed care, while important, doesn't always provide the more holistic way. And so it's a perspective, it's an approach, and it's a strategy that addresses harm and restores well-being. It supports the systems from shifting from a culture of harm and discipline and punishment and confinement to restoration, hope, and healing. So when we talk about healing-centered engagement, it's non-clinical, And it uses a strength-based approach. It tries to ask the question, what's right with you? What are your dreams? What do you aspire to be? What are your assets? We try to focus on what young people's assets are and build from there. And it provides a holistic view of healing and recenters culture, race, and identity as a central feature of our well-being. We know that oftentimes identity is one of the first things that are harmed in our society, whether we're gay, lesbian, or trans, or queer, whether we're people of color, women, poor. Our identities are oftentimes the first things that get harmed in our schools and our after-school programs. And so healing-centered engagement says we have to center that. We have to restore a sense of ourselves. We have to restore a sense of we have to restore our identities of our young people. And by doing that, it means that we have to actually go through a process so that our identities are holistic as well. Healing-centered engagement acknowledges how trauma is experienced collectively. It's not just an individual experience. It also says that, as I mentioned before, that it considers the root causes of trauma that exist in the environment and not just the individual. And healing-centered engagement focuses on the restoration and healing rather than coping with symptoms. And if we know that when we talk about therapy and therapeutic responses, it is oftentimes focused on the reduction of symptomology. Let me reduce symptoms of anxiety. Let me reduce symptoms of shame. Let me reduce symptoms of anger. Let me give you tools to do anger management. And while these tools are important, it doesn't always provide the type of restoration as a response to the harm that happens. So for example, if a young person's trauma is a result of racial harm from the police, right? That we have to use strategies that allow for young people to understand that it is not the cause that the trauma that they experienced happened, but that their racial and ethnic and identities also should be restored. Lastly, healing-centered engagement is an asset-driven approach that looks at the symptoms that we want to foster and support rather than symptoms we want to suppress. And then lastly, and very importantly, healing-centered engagement supports adult providers with their own healing. As I said before, how can we expect adults who are in front of young people who also experience trauma and have shame to support the well-being of young people? I remember working with an organization in California where they were training young men of color, adults. These were teachers and lawyers and doctors, men of color, to work with young men of color. But the adults had shame for being Black. The adults had shame for being Latino. The adults had shame for where they came from. And that shame of their identities had not been healed. And as a result, that shame was then transferred to their, quote, mentoring of the young people. And so if we are not taking seriously the ways in which adults need to heal and to restore their identities, again, if we're not centering that in a healing-centered process, then sometimes we reproduce the harm for young people.
You got something out of that. The way that I am hearing Dr. Ginwright is as a direction of where we can start to go to really deepen this work and to bring together some of our work in social and emotional learning and equity and inclusion. And I know that a lot of other folks are really thinking about how to bring some of those two things together, because I think they belong together. We want to be able to create spaces where people really feel welcoming and where identities are honored and affirmed, and where we can start to form really authentic relationships across differences. There are certainly from both sides of things we can imagine how cultivating some of the self-awareness, awareness of how it feels in situations where I'm having to, do some of the work involved in healing or in hearing about someone else's experience or trauma. All those things can bring up difficult emotions that we can, sort of use some of these capacities that we're growing and some of these tools in order to show up even in those really difficult conversations and with those difficult experiences, to really be present with one another and not shut down or not sense a threat in that situation and then just head for the exit, to really kind of show up and be there and do the work. And so I really feel a sense of hope there. And I think some of the things that he talks about there are, can be sort of signposts as we think about how to move this work forward in ways that really feel honoring and affirming for everybody, and that helps us move in the direction of a world we want to create and we want to live in together. So last thing. All right, so we're kind of at the end of the path here. Move on to the next slide. Another thing I think that Dr. Jin Wright pointed out is how important it is, when your concern is to help young people, that, let's flip that, he talks about switch from the lens to mirror, right? Let's turn that mirror around. And that's hard, right? It's like, well, didn't I already go through all this myself? Why am I having to learn this stuff? But, it is a lifelong journey, and there are immense rewards. I do feel like, as you walk the path, and many of you have and are pretty far along on this journey already, and can attest, maybe can send a thumbs up, that as you build these skills, as you develop these tools, you can notice some changes, some changes in yourself and your ability to show up, to be resilient in the face of conflict, to kind of quiet your own inner voice and really be there, in a moment, in a present moment with somebody else, and how connecting that can feel, how good that can feel, both to you and to that other person. And so as you go out and do this work, I encourage you to think about, what your individual path forward can look like. What's the next step for you? And some things that come to mind for me, and I see showing up there, to go slow. Just slowing things down can make a huge difference, in order to do this work of recognizing what's going on with me, or recognizing what's going on with you. That's not something that if you're, rush is you're going to be able to get through. And so slow down, be kind. Kindness, man. It can get you pretty darn far in this world. And curiosity, staying open and curious to your own experience and to the experience of other people. And then, what's our collective path forward? You are not just individual islands doing this. There are many, many of us here on this call who are wanting to do this work, who are doing this work. And as powerful as we are individually, we are so much more powerful together. And so I encourage you to think about, like, who can you reach out to? Who can you connect with? Who are you already connecting with, and how can you broaden the circle to do this work and to form these communities of authenticity and of emotional well-being and of healing, for our kids and for ourselves. All right. So as we think about finishing up, I guess, so here's, this will be in the slide deck, which you'll have access to some of the books that I have referenced and referred to, and you can take a look at those. And I don't know if there's any way for me to communicate with you, but I'm always, happy to get mail and hear about what you are reading and coming up with in terms of accessing resources that can be helpful to you. I do invite you to visit again the backpack on the Padlet, and or just write in the chat, something. Just take a little inventory and think about something that has landed for you, something that you want to remember, something that maybe you really are feeling like, okay, I want to say this out loud because I want to work on this thing, or I want to reach out to this person or something. It can sometimes help. Both to help you remember something about what you want to take with you, and also just to share, because you're such amazing resources for each other. And an idea that you have might be something that someone else is also thinking. And it's just so affirming, to be with people who are doing this work and who are committed to it the way that I know that so many of you are. So with that, let's take a few minutes maybe to take a look at that Padlet, see if you want to add something in the chat. And I've got a few minutes here for questions. Checking to see if I need to heal first. Yeah. I'm task driven. I need to slow down. Yeah, it's hard, right? There's a lot. Teachers in particular, man, there's so much to do, and just finding that time can be so difficult.
Bonnie, there's a question in the Q&A, and it says, can you please talk about how to show up efficiently? Sometimes this needs to happen, but in the middle of a lesson, and if a teacher waits, it may be too late, or the student may feel invisible, or no one cares.
Yeah, so I do think sometimes that's necessary, right? We this is not the moment to really sort of stop everything, so I guess something that comes to mind is just to make sure that you do a little bit of the nonverbal signaling that I see you, I get you. Thank you for sharing that. And this is, or maybe a quick reflection, like it's in the nonviolent communication, there's a discussion about, look for the feeling and the need. And if you can validate that, it seems like you're feeling X, and, maybe that's because of Y, and that's, provide some validation for that. And then, that's not something we can tackle right now. And maybe, just come up with some sort of solution. We can talk about it after class, or, why don't you, let's find a time where we can connect around that outside of this present moment. Those are just some things, but just those simple little quick acts of recognition and validation. Like, I see you. Yeah, I get that. I hear you. I hear what you're saying. And let's find a time to address that later. That's what comes to mind. If anyone else has any other suggestions, do feel free. I know there's some experts among us. Go ahead and drop that into the chat too. Yeah, okay. I hear you. Yeah, let's talk about it after class. Yeah, this doesn't mean that you have to, boundaries are still important, and it's important for kids to understand, and there's, it's not always the right time to stop everything and engage in one of these very intense kinds of conversations. And you don't have to do it alone. There's other people, that you can encourage them to talk to you and refer to, and that can provide that support. And the more that students develop these tools, the more they can provide that sort of, the sorts of skills in their interactions with one another as well. And parents too. That's one of the reasons I do the work with parents. These are things that very few of us older folks learned growing up. And so we can give ourselves, some slack that we aren't masters at this, at this stage.
Bonnie, there's another question in the chat about the person is asking how to handle a person I work with that doesn't have empathy.
Yeah, that's super hard. And so what I would say is, just first of all, just watch out, be careful with yourself, when you're interacting with that person. And I think it's still possible. And this is, again, nonviolent communication it has a lot of insights for dealing with difficult situations and sometimes with difficult people, and sometimes just reflecting, like listening for their unmet needs or their feelings. Like, oh, it sounds like you're feeling this. Is that true? And maybe, just sort of make a guess about what they might need from you. I guess I'm curious to know the ways in which that shows up as problematic. Is it they're just like they're hard to be around, or and if that's the case, I guess then you can flip it around and imagine. And again, so another resource that I really love is a book called Difficult Conversations. This is a book that I really wish I had like 20 years ago. So many things in my life would be so much easier if I had access to this book. But they talk specifically about ways to communicate when you are feeling like, I have, instead of saying you're not listening to me, or I don't think you're empathetic, to talk about, to bring up like, I sometimes feel left out, or I sometimes feel like I don't get a chance to speak, and then, make some kind of request, and sometimes we're super shy about doing this, but it can be really helpful, especially when you put things in I language, like this is how I'm feeling, and being willing to risk some vulnerability about how you're feeling. And then, make a request. I wonder if X, and people can surprise you. Sometimes they're not aware. And oftentimes, especially when you are willing to connect in that authentic way about your feelings, they're willing to meet you halfway and honor requests that you might have. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I statements. Rule. Yeah, for real.
There is also another question in the Q&A box saying, who is the author of Difficult Conversations?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Jisoo?
Yeah, the question is, who is the author of Difficult Conversations?
Yes. Right here. It's handy. And it's Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. I can never remember it because it's 3 authors, but that's who it's by. And that's what it looks like. Purple book. There's a comment in the chat that says, I always try to look at children as more than. I think many loving and well-meaning adults forget how smart and advanced the thinking and awareness of kids is. Kid radar is very powerful. Yeah, they quickly pick up on how much you respect and accept them. Ain't that the truth? Yeah, for real. And they're picking up, this was a hard one for me as a teacher, as a parent, how much they're picking up on all of our nonverbal signals, whether we want to or not. If we're anxious, we're tense, they're going to pick up on that. And so, yeah, it's good to put some thought into how you want to show up in advance. Yeah, someone mentions it's important to separate the student from the behavior, right? Yeah, another another resource. I don't think this one is listed. It's a parenting book, so it's I use that more when I work with parents. But it's called Good Inside, and the thesis is really powerful and really important. That one of the main things that we can always communicate to kids is that they're good inside. They are good people. And if you there's behavior and there's choices, and then there's the sort of core that's good and valuable in kids. And if we can figure out how to communicate those things, both you are a good person inside, and you're in this challenging situation, and this behavior is not something that it has impacts on other people, but you're still a good person.
Thanks for sharing, Bonnie. There is also another question in the Q&A box. It's saying, often in this state, educators are faced with a language barrier. Could you share a few tips on conveying empathy in a visual way?
Yeah, I would refer to some of the things that we've talked about. I think just kindness can be conveyed in our tone of voice, just something that's soft and friendly, in our willingness to make eye contact, if that is culturally appropriate, and that's not always. That's something to be aware of. But if that's something that they feel comfortable with, like just let them know that you see them. Just a kind of an open posture and a more relaxed body language are ways that you can signal acceptance and friendliness and empathy for someone. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking in terms of language learners. I think mutual, like a vulnerability, if you can let I don't know what sort of how big the language barrier might be, but let them know that everybody struggles, and that's normalize challenges, and that can be helpful too if the issue is that they're struggling with language. Let's see. Oh, this is an interesting one. I try to look at students as them in 20 years, and it changes everything, because I know when they're an adult, they'll have more empathy, maturity. Yeah. Yeah. Taking that long view and responding from the perspective of, who will they be in 20 years? And sometimes as a parent, and also, maybe in our relationship with some of the students that we know, thinking about like, how would I respond to them if I had, their 20-year-old self or their 30-year-old self in mind? What would be the, how would I show up? But also, like, what would be the responsible and boundaries that I would set in this relationship? Yeah. Lead by example. Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I do feel like social emotional learning for adults is so important. And because it's one thing to, have a curriculum that has you go through a series of exercises, and it can be even more powerful when just a natural situation shows up. And because you have, worked out these regulation strategies yourself, you can model them, and in the moment, and you're showing up with empathy in these situations because you've thought about it and you've worked on it. And those are such powerful, as those are the most powerful ways of teaching these skills, is when they see them unfold before their very eyes. Anything else you'd like to share, or any thoughts that you're having about some of this material? We've got a few more minutes. If not, then I guess I'll hand it back over to Leonie and Kenzie.
Thank you, Bonnie. And just thank you so much. I just really appreciate all of the wealth of information you shared with us tonight, and the ability to engage. It was so nice. I know it's so hard on a webinar, but appreciate those opportunities and appreciate everyone engaging with us. So yeah, just thank you so much. And there's lots of, as you can see, appreciation in reactions in the chat, and love and clapping and thumbs up. So again, just thank you so much. And I know this was your third and final presentation with us and webinar with us. So yeah, I'm going to miss these. We have one more with Sue Lynn and Marissa next month, but just want to thank you so much for all that you've done for us, Bonnie.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and I feel so honored to be with teachers who clearly care so much for their students and are working so hard to just be the best they can and do what they can for kids. So it's my honor to be here.
Thank you. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much. We have a few closing slides. Feel free, the information that we're going to share is also addressed in the SELves series FAQ, and I know Mackenzie put that in the chat already, so thanks, Mackenzie. If you need to hop off at this time, feel free to do so, but Mackenzie and I will be on here to share some more information about the remaining in our series about clock hours, and then we'll stay on to answer questions as well. We did want to share with you, if you are interested in this topic, we have talked a lot here in these webinars about building your own social emotional capacity as adults and as educators. OSPI also has some great SEL modules that are designed to build knowledge and awareness for teachers, administrators, and school staff about what social emotional learning is and why it's important. In addition, the modules explain how to implement and integrate SEL into different contexts in a culturally responsive way. So this will also help with you in working with students in SEL after you've or as you are building your own adult capacity, because we know that building our own adult capacity is one of the very best ways to help our students. But you can see here, there is a link to the modules. There are free clock hours available for the modules, and they're self-paced, so you can complete them at your own pace. And I don't know if the link has already been put in the chat, but Mackenzie, perhaps you could put the link to the modules in the chat. So thank you. All right. And then on the next slide, we just wanted to mention again that with this series, you could earn up to 38 free clock hours. We offered 1 clock hour for the series kickoff, 2 clock hours for each session you attended. You can earn an additional 25 clock hours by completing a PGP, and we have a little more information about that in one of the upcoming slides. And at each session, you'll be given a link to register through the PD enroller for the clock hours for the session you attended. And on the next slide, I think we might have our links. Let's see. Yes, thank you, Matt. So you can enroll for the clock hours for tonight's session at this link in PD Enroller. And I think Mackenzie can put that in the chat, or someone can put that in the chat for you. And in order to earn these clock hours, you'll register for PD Enroller and then either attend the live training session like you did tonight, or you can view the recording of the training and submit the clock hour attestation form. You do not need to do both. So if you attended tonight, you don't need to submit the clock hour attestation form, but you do need to enroll for the clock hours. Please allow, it takes us 2 to 4 weeks to get the recording edited and captioned and published, but once that has happened, we have your email addresses from registration, and we will send that out to you as well. Okay, and we can go on to the next slide. And Mackenzie, I'm not sure, is this still me? Oh, sorry, I think I
it's
did
me.
your
That's
part of
okay.
yours. I'm so
No
sorry.
problem.
Go ahead.
We wanted to give you a heads up about the next session. So this red arrow is pointing out to today's session. Our next session will be on Monday, April 17th, and that will be our final session for this webinar series. So all the links for the past sessions and recordings can be found on the SEL series schedule document, which we will put a link to that in the chat. But I will send a follow-up email to this webinar today with all the links that we've talked about today, as well as a link to the slides so that you can go back and review, and there'll be links to the video that we watched as well, so you can have that. All right, I think we can go to the next slide. The next slide is just a recap about how to get the webinar, or how to get clock hours for these sessions. So to attend the future session, our next session in April, you'll register through the Zoom link provided in the SEL series schedule. You'll also, so make sure to save that Zoom registration once you register for it, so that you can easily log in. And then to earn clock hours for that future session in April, you'll register through PD Enroller. So there's two, you'll need to register through Zoom as well as PD Enroller in order to get the clock hours. To get the past recordings for past sessions, like I said, that's in the SEL series schedule that Leonie just put in the chat. So all the recordings are linked there. And to get clock hours for watching the recordings, you will need to fill out the PD Enroller link for that session, as well as an attestation form. And that is, the attestation form is to certify that you watched the recording so that we can count your attendance for that. We'll go to the next slide. If you have additional questions about clock hours, please refer back to our FAQ document. We'll put that link in the chat again as well. The FAQ document has tons of answers to questions that that go with this webinar series about clock hours, what clock hours are, how to earn clock hours, how to register, how the e-certification system works. So this is there's tons of information if you are confused about any part of the clock hour process there. And then I'll pass it back to Leonie.
Thank you, Mackenzie. So as I mentioned earlier, you can earn up to 25 clock hours for completing a professional growth plan around these webinars. And this is some information here. You can go to our website on pesb.wa.gov, and you'll see there, it's circled on top, you'll see a tab come up that says current educators. And then you can go down to professional growth plans click on that. And then this will bring up another page where you can actually choose your role as an educator. And that page will give you more information and some samples. And we even have how-to videos now are published on completing the PGPs. So you can go to that section there to find more information if you want to complete a professional growth plan around these webinars. All right, and so we are coming up on our very last session next month of this 6-session series. So Bonnie, Dr. McDaniel has presented 3 sessions, and then we've had already 2 sessions with Dr. Marisa Windmill and Sulan Hukano, and they will be presenting their last session on Monday, April 17th from 4:30 to 6:30. And we're so grateful that we're able to have all 3 of these presenters, because they present in a variety of ways and they really build on each other and really complement each other. Dr. Windmill and Sulan Hukano are going to be talking next session about self-efficacy and social engagement and community. And they'll be talked about activating my superpower in sustaining healthy ecosystems, how to develop as an individual and as a member of a community while helping others do the same. And so you can see the description here in their final session. They'll revisit understanding who we are and what we are here to contribute. We'll understand the symbiotic relationship to everything and all that is around us within the ecosystem. And we will co-create a healthy environment through self-growth, inquiry, diverse lived experiences, and transformative practices. So we really hope that you can join us next month as well. I have learned so much myself just from attending these. And Bonnie, I was going to tell you, I just always come away feeling so calm after listening to you as well. And it's just a nice, quiet time in my day to be able to breathe. So thank you for that. And looking forward to that as well next month. All right, so I think that is all the information we have to share with you. If you have further questions, Mackenzie and I are happy to stay on here to answer any questions you have. So I think on the next slide, Matt, if you can share that, that is contact information for Mackenzie or I. So again, if you do have questions and aren't able to stay on tonight or don't have them answered or think of them after you're off, feel free to email either Mackenzie or myself, and we will try to help you out as much as we can. So awesome. Thank you. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Mackenzie and I can try to answer them. Or at this point, since our, the webinar is really over and number of participants is going down, we can try to call on you if you raise your hand as well, but it's probably easier for us to see you if you put it in the Q&A. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. We're so glad you joined us. And we will hopefully see you next month.